collection is obviously an issue that comes up around the world, and efforts that simply deal with use and not collection end up bumping into those who are worried that collection means the NSA, collection means who goes. How do you sort of respond to the concern about collection? Is some of it, let's recognize that the data stewards or the policymakers will recognize the legitimate value of certain collection, and then it's other kinds of collection that might end up being subject to choice or restrictions? How does this address the collection concern?
I think Jacob has really framed the reality of it, and one of the messaging challenges is the core of all our work starts with principles. It doesn't leave those alone. It says that, and I harken back to David Smith's wonderful critique at the OECD, which said, that the principles really aren't the problem. It's the way we've implemented them over the last 20 or 30 years that have become the problem. And now it's time to change. Collection, of course, has to play a role in it, but a byproduct, in my view, of what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that we've focused perhaps too much on collection, which made lots of sense when you could count the number of transatlantic data transfers on one hand and still have fingers left over, may not make the same degree of sense in a ubiquitous world of wearable computing. But that doesn't mean to say that collection isn't important. It also doesn't mean to say that most of the other existing fair information principles still applies. Of course, data security still applies. Of course, a right to access information still applies. But I want to actually, the consent thing is just an interesting messaging example that I actually want to borrow from something you said this morning, which was so profound. Having a debate about whether consent actually is the European model and the American model probably isn't all that useful. You framed it in terms of, instead of trying to rationalize or fight between the two sides, saying your model needs to change to ours needs to change to ours. One of the things I think we would be doing a great disservice is if we say, well, you're wrong in your premise, consent isn't dominant, therefore your conclusions are all wrong. That would be disastrous. What I think we say is, look, that's but one reason why the model needs to change. It doesn't much matter. We should actually almost close that debate and say, in a world of ubiquitous computing, of automated data collection, of machine learning, machine decision making, we do need to find a different model, and it should be likely more based on responsibility of data stewards around use, recognizing that there are still many other principles. One thing that has actually got no press, which I think is kind of interesting in a way, one of the suggestions we actually made to the revisions to the principles was to embed a principle of enforcement. That seems a pretty powerful advancement to data protection, and somewhat at odds with perhaps the people you met in Silicon Valley that said that it's contrary to the business model. So I think that
but that's the one point I fully agree. Well-funded DPAs, yeah. So, absolutely, all with you.
Yeah. And although I'll note there are obviously many well-funded startups in Silicon Valley, and yes, I feel like a grandfather too when we were visiting a couple of the companies. Let's just note that about maybe half of the economy in the U.S. is regulated by significant use-based restrictions, banking, credit, employment, and many of those startups start moving along, and then they learn that, well, there's health data involved, and so, sorry, they actually are now subject to some very stricter often than many of the EU-based laws around restrictions for HIPAA on health data or banking data or credit data or employment data. And so one day someone's got to do a good economic analysis. But of course, the sexy companies who are doing some of the wildest and craziest things obviously are some of our, sometimes our tech startups who do indeed need to bump into the concern. I think we're going to try to squeeze in one question, but reaction from anybody else on the panel?
If I can just, I think actually Jacob and I are very close on most of these points, or one or two differences, but I think absolutely, Jacob, I think none of us are seeking to legitimize unacceptable business practices. When you talk about some business models, we're trying to legitimize those. Absolutely not. I mean, what I would say is some of these startups, if you tell them, you can go ahead, but you must not offend fundamental rights and freedoms, they will just carry on. So I worry about that. And I think the point we've made, really, this is all about trying to shift more real responsibility onto the shoulders of the data controllers. and give more confidence to the consumers. I mean, in another area, food safety, there's been big debates around how you communicate the risks of certain sorts of diets and certain ingredients to consumers. And in the end, that debate finally, to quite a large extent, got boiled down to the traffic light approach. And consumers now, red, amber, green. If we can do more of that, if we can signal the risk areas, the green areas which are completely safe, the low priority areas, and maybe the amber areas where you need to take a little more care on both sides. And just finally, responding to your point, Jules, I mean, absolutely, the papers we are developing do mention benefits. There wasn't time in my 3-minute presentation just then, but balancing the benefits is absolutely fundamental. We completely accept that.